US-driven Western demonization of Muslims.
Yeah.
And as we said earlier, fortunately, more and more people are now starting to question the validity of the official story of 9/11. And I think that ultimately, of course, this is potentially going to be their undoing. But let's not forget that also the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was the introduction of the Patriot Act,
Yeah.
which was already prepared, which no senator was given any time to read, and it was signed off, basically overnight, just at George Bush's behest. And it was only later that people started to sort of question, some of the content of the Patriot Act, but of course it was too late. And, how does a senator say, well, yeah, actually I signed it, but I hadn't read it? They're not going to admit that.
Of course not.
So, it just goes into law.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after the Patriot Act, we have the Homeland Security Act. We also have this abomination of Guantanamo Bay, which is operating outside of the U.S. judicial system. And the U.S. has effectively, since 2003, been a dictatorship. Because in 2003, George Bush signed legislation which effectively gave the state law enforcement agencies the right to arrest anybody who effectively was perceived as being a threat to U.S. security. And the terms of this legislation are so broad that it actually can come right down to anybody who has the audacity to criticize U.S. foreign policy. And not just to arrest those people, but to literally confiscate, the exact term in the legislation is sequester, but to confiscate all of their worldly possessions. So effectively obliterate that person from the electoral roll, if you like, in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the London bombings gave Tony Blair the opportunity to introduce some very, very similar legislation. And I just have to tell you something, Henrik, if you're not aware already, about the London bombings, because the perpetrators of these kind of atrocities are becoming so arrogant that they leave their calling card, so that those of us who are monitoring them and watching them and know that they are behind these events, they're basically sticking the finger up at us and saying, what, guys, we can be so outrageously blatant and we can still get away with this because, and I'll quote from Hitler in Mein Kampf when he said that, the greater the crime perpetrated by the leadership, the less likelihood there is that the people will ever believe that their leaders are capable of perpetrating such an event.
Yeah.
And on the July 7th bombings, on the side of the bus that exploded in Tavistock Square, and there's a whole bunch of very interesting connections with the location where the bomb went off as well. But on the side of the bus is the hoarding from a film that had just been released prior to this event, and the film was called The Descent. And if your listeners go to Google and they Google London bombings and they go to pictures, and they will see this bus for themselves, and on the side of the bus, what it says is outright terror, bold and brilliant. And this is the guys leaving their calling card.
Yeah. And as you said, the locations, I mean, just outside Tavistock Square, we know psychological warfare in a way right there. Might be evidence
exactly,
of that.
The Tavistock Institute.
Yeah. And then, of course, I think there are even one van, let's see if I can find this now, that was... Exactly, there you go. And this was, wasn't this a firm that in some way was connected with controlled demolition? Controlled demolition, there you go.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, it may have been pure coincidence.
Of course, always.
I mean, even the connotations of Kingstar, and obviously we get into a much deeper debate here as to, what is controlling,
a
lot of these apparent coincidences. And there is no question that once you actually take a look at the official version of events of the London bombings, they don't stack up. I mean, the British government has, of course, refused to have conduct an investigation into the event. They did release what they laughingly called a narrative, which is basically a work of fiction. And, what we've established beyond any reasonable doubt in the UK is that first of all, the train that the alleged perpetrators supposedly caught in all the initial official version of events was actually cancelled that morning. And then, so they had to change their version of events. So they came up with another train. Well, we didn't have to make too much of an inquiry to establish that the train that they were now supposed to have caught didn't actually arrive in London until after the first underground train had left King's Cross. So in other words, the alleged perpetrators could not have physically been on the first train that exploded. So, I don't know what happened. Of course I don't know what happened. But what I do know is that there are so many holes in the official account that, a public inquiry, well, we know in this country a public inquiry is a waste of time because they're all stage managed anyway. But I mean, this is where we're at right now. And in fact, I'm going to give a talk in a few weeks. And the title of that talk is, Are We Asleep, Drunk or Stupid?
There we go.
And the reason I use this title is because there are so many outrageous things occurring that any one of them in isolation should have the people out on the streets.
Right.
But you know what happens? We just all get on with watching really anodyne TV, the soap operas, the sport, and of course with the latest pressure on petrol prices and the credit crunch, people are effectively kept under control by the fear of not being able to put food on the table for their family.
Yeah.
But we have to step beyond this. We really have to get people to acknowledge that, living under an oppressive regime, which is obviously what these guys are intending to implement with their one world order, is that really an option? Is that really the way forward for humanity?
No, it isn't.
Well, this is our challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more obviously to say about the London bombings, but if we kind of focus on what the outcome of it has been, I mean, we've been talking about Zion and all this, but what we can say here at this point then is that. And as you mentioned, demonization of Muslims who are subsequently picked up right after this. They're targeting the Middle East. We know that there are some countries in this region that they are looking at. In this case, we can talk about Syria, we can talk about Israel, we can talk about Lebanon. And what I want to ask you, Ian, is why do you consider this particular area to be of interest to the New World Order?
Well, there's a number of reasons, but I think primarily, and I'm going to go into a realm of conjecture here, but let's call it educated conjecture. One of the things that had fascinated me through my research, is the fact that ancient knowledge has been returned to us over the last 120 years. Well, actually it's 180 years because I can pinpoint the point at which ancient knowledge has been returned to us. Knowledge that has been lost really ever since the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. And, as I was studying mythology and cosmology and comparative mythology in particular, looking at the mythology of the old and the new worlds and of the more remote regions, what absolutely fascinated me was that effectively we had a complete disconnect from 415, when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed by the Cyrillian monks, until 1820, when Jean-Francois Champollion deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphs thanks to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone.
Right.
Now, one of the things, Henrik, that is very interesting for me is that Jean-Francois Champollion actually told his parents in 1797 that he had come here, he had incarnated to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And this was actually documented by his elder brother. Now, interestingly, the Rosetta Stone, which of course was critical to the deciphering of the hieroglyphs, wasn't actually discovered for another 2 years.
There we go.
It was discovered in 1799.
Right.
Well, Champollion got on with his work, and by 1820, he had effectively cracked the hieroglyphs. So over the next century or so, then many scholars got after deciphering the hieroglyphs, and we have some wonderful turn-of-the-century scholars like Wallace Budge, who weren't in any way constrained by orthodoxy, and were able to sort of write what they truly felt. And then, of course, we started to break other of the ancient scripts. But then we have the return of some ancient scrolls. We have the Nag Hammadi scrolls in 1945. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. And then in the last 30 years, of course, we've cracked the Mayan glyphs, thanks to the work of a Russian Mayanist called Tatiana Proskuryakov.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have access to a lot of knowledge again that had been lost to mankind for almost 2 millennia. And, what is very interesting is that, contained within this information is many, many references to this particular time in our evolutionary process being very significant. And of course, not least of that is the Mayan calendar, which we're in a 5,125 year cycle in the Mayan calendar, and the current cycle comes to an end at 11/11 on December 21st, 2012.
Right.
Now, in my opinion, and based on my research, I believe that the brotherhoods, the secret societies, have known about this date for hundreds of years, perhaps even for millennia.
Right.
But the year of 2012 has only been in the wider consciousness since the late 1980s, with the publication of Jose Arguelles' book, The Mayan Factor.
Right.
And in the course of my mythological research, I was fascinated, of course, by the Sumerian texts, because these, of course, are arguably the oldest records. Of course, it's dismissed in the Orthodox world as mythology. But, I believe that many of the texts are not mythological. They are, in fact, historical. And they were written at a time when, obviously people had very, very different perceptions to that which we have. And they also talk about, man's origins. And I think one of the things that is becoming more and more accepted in non-Orthodox circles is that mankind is effectively a genetic creation. I mean, this is spelled out very clearly in the Sumerian texts. It was clearly the understanding and accepted wisdom some sort of 5 millennia ago, but of course that has been changed with the introduction of our current Orthodox religions.
Right.
Well, within the particularly the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jared, what we have there is the story of the creators of mankind, and it actually identifies the individuals involved in this genetic creation of mankind, which was Enki and his partner Ninhursag, who was a genetic engineer. And these were part of the what we know as, or we refer to as, the Anunnaki, or the Anunnaki,
right,
depending on which pronunciation you prefer. But effectively, the translation means those who from heaven to earth came. And what we also know from these texts is that there were a group within the Anunnaki who were effectively pilots. I mean, it seems that they were responsible for transporting whatever it was that was being mined here on Earth, and many scholars believe that was gold. But whatever was being mined here on Earth, they were responsible for shipping it. Well, and then shipping it to off-planet bases where it was then shipped on to its ultimate destination, which many scholars believe was a place called Nibiru, planet Nibiru,
right,
or often referred to as Planet X. Now, what we know from the Sumerian scripts is that this group of pilots, because they were based here on Earth, they found the human women, this genetic creation of Enki and Ninhursag, they found the human women to be very attractive. And although it was against the Anunnaki law, they started to, have sex with the human women and, in fact, establish relations with them. And this was very much frowned upon. And they were sentenced